have room to put all this. Oops, sorry. I didn't have time to include, or I didn't have space to include all the contributors' names, but every one of these chapters, many of them have lots of different, again, contributors from around the country, from around different parts of higher education. So we tried to keep it a very diverse group of folks who contributed to the book. But you can see here that part one of the book really focuses on the foundational concepts of family engagement, while part two really highlights specific functional ways that colleges and universities can engage families. Toward the very beginning, in our introduction and in chapter two, we talk a lot about stories that we've all experienced in working with families. And to me, that was one of the most fun chapters to write, because we got to talk about our day-to-day experiences in working with families. While I can't share all of that here this afternoon in this brief webinar, I did want to start by talking about defining family engagement. What exactly is it? We have a definition from the book on your screen. It's basically allocating time, energy, and resources in ways that support student success, while also aligning with the student's needs related to learning and development. So basically, it's inviting families to work alongside us to support student success, while also recognizing students' increasing interdependence and autonomy. And through the figure that you see on the screen here, we talk about family engagement along a spectrum. On the left, you have those unconnected families who are not really engaged at all, it could be for a number of reasons. On the right, you have those disruptive families, those ones that we all have those stories about. We call them sometimes helicopter parents, those ones that are being intrusive and disruptive in our work with students. And then in the middle, we have those engaged families, and that's really what we're shooting for. Again, when you think about why a family might be disruptive at any given point, you got to ask yourself why. Maybe it's because they're anxious about their student. Maybe their student has suffered some trauma and that parent has really been involved in advocating for that student. Or maybe that student has some needs that we're just not aware of. But what part of it, I think, is they simply don't have the information. And that's where we can really involve them, get them the information that they need so that they're not constantly calling and asking questions. We're already being proactive about providing them the information that they need to support their students. And that's really what engagement and an engaged family really is. For us, that challenge of those disruptive helicopter parents is unfortunate. And again, we all have those stories, but even more concerning are those unconnected families, the ones that are unable to support their students for whatever reason. And it's also important to note that families may move along this spectrum at any given time. When we have families whose students are just admitted, or even through their first year, they're hopefully they're engaged, right? They're asking questions, they're seeking how to support their students, they're reading our emails, they're coming to orientation, they're doing all those great things to help support their students because it's new. And they may have a lot of anxiety about some of these things. By the time their students are on that last year, they may kind of move over to that unconnected phase. They may not feel the need to be as connected to the university as they did, and that's completely normal. But just know that it happens along a spectrum, and that really our goal is to get them in that engaged range. So again, foundations in this part of the book. Amy's going to talk about, what are our families? What do they look like?
Thanks, Chris. And hi, everyone. We love our TACUSPA family, so we're glad to be here today. And, we actually started our book with welcome to our family because we saw this as this opportunity, as Chris said, to bring together more than 20, probably 25 different individuals across the field who are related by this common interest. And I think that's probably why you're here today, in family engagement, in higher education, and in student success. And so welcome to the family. But one of the chapters in our foundations area highlights a couple of themes, and there's these themes that really go throughout all of the chapters in the book. And this chapter on families of every shape and size highlight the idea that one of the elements in the book is we wanted to push and expand the concept of what we mean by family and the definition of family. And second, we wanted to continue to focus on the idea, as Chris said, of building families' capacities to support our students. And so we knew we wanted to consider a very broad definition of family, recognizing that family is individually constructed and that our student populations are increasingly diverse. So what a family looks like for one student looks very different for another, and that our definitions of family should be adaptive and inclusive. So in this chapter, we talk about and define 3 different types of families: immediate families, those that were born or adopted into; extended families; and then really, and I think the important one here, is our chosen families, those friends and partners and other supports that students build around themselves and that become family as a part of this process. The chapter also highlights different populations of students that we need to be attentive to when we're thinking about family engagement, such as foster care alumni and emancipated youth, as well as a population that we talk about in the future family engagement around those students who are caregivers to families. So I think oftentimes we think about families giving support to students, but we know that students are also supporting their families, whether it be through childcare or helping it with those who are aging parents or aging family members and providing that type of care. So really expanding that definition of family is an important piece that we hope you would leave with after reading the book and today's webinar. The second element of the chapter again looks at what types of support do families give and how do we build that capacity of families to be able to provide that support. So thinking about all of the ways families engage and how that's often invisible to us, that it maybe they're discussing their career experiences with students, they're helping them find resources and services, maybe they're helping with financial support and resources, or helping them complete course requirements, whatever that may be. We have to find ways to help families build that capacity across really the 4 areas on the screen. You might think of this as building their knowledge and cognitive and capacity for understanding and applying the information related to the higher ed experience. You might think about helping them build their emotional capacity, those attitudes and the beliefs about this whole idea of college and relationships and mental supports that they need to manage these challenges. And then you might think about that resource capacity, financial and physical resources, whether that be time, money, other family resources that they can use toward family engagement in the college experience. So those are 2 elements. How do we build up family capacity, and how do we continue to expand that definition of family? Elizabeth, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Amy. The next chapter talks about really managing the tradition or the college transition. And I think we know that students make a transition, but their families make a transition too, whether this is their first student to go out into an institution of higher education or their last student. They are transitioning as well. And how do we as institutions focus on families to help their student be successful, but also help the family member or that support system for that student be successful? And do that through a variety of different ways. I think the first opportunity we have to do something, probably the more formal piece, is during our orientation sessions with families. And how are we involving them in those conversations? And what are we, what kind of expectations are we setting? How are we communicating? How are we letting them know this is an appropriate level of involvement? So you're right in that middle of that continuum that Christine shared earlier. Also letting them know that we want them to be involved, and this is how you can be involved. There are some limitations on your involvement, and this is a transition as much for you as for your student. But talking with them even about what does FERPA mean or HIPAA mean, because as we all know, families come in and they expect to see everything for their student because that's what they've experienced previously. And thinking about orientation specifically, how are you using those orientation leaders? A lot of times families really like to talk to current students about their expectations, what they've learned, what they wish their family did or did not do, frequency of maybe the times they go home or their family came to visit them. So finding a way to connect those orientation leaders or students that are involved perhaps in your orientation process and connecting them with families so they can get some perspective from a current student. Also recognizing about family needs. Families, as we've talked about, come in all shapes and sizes with different backgrounds and experiences. And so whether it's their first student or their last student, make sure you understand your audience. Prioritize and be aware that some families can't come to orientation because of work or other responsibilities back home. So how are you going to get the information to them so they know that they are valued and a part of this process? And then scope. Orientation might be 2 days if you're lucky. Maybe it's just a day. We cannot possibly cram all of the information we want to share with students into one day. And so really prioritizing that information that you need to share with them. And then finally, making sure you're doing some assessment. Throughout this chapter in this book, there are some outlines for orientation. There's some examples of assessment, whether it's polling or questionnaires that can be really helpful in guiding some of this programming. But then, like I said, families come in all shapes and sizes. Maybe they can or can't come to orientation. And then, so how do you communicate with them maybe after orientation and then throughout their time at the institution? Chris, I think you're going to talk more about communication.
I was muted there, sorry. Communication is probably the most common way that most of our institutions involve and attempt to engage families. And so it's probably that area where we have the most opportunity to excel. Email continues to be the most used form of communication with families. As an example, on our campus here at Texas Tech, the emails that we send to families from my office through our campus ESP portal, which I'll talk about in a second, we get about 70% open rates from those emails. Students, we would probably love if we were emailing students if 70% of them would open those emails. So families are very keen on reading information from their students' college and universities. And right now, email's where it's at, but of course that's evolving. Soon we're going to have more expectation that we text families. We're not there yet in a lot of places. Some folks are already doing that. When you're thinking about your communications with families, it shouldn't be just one-sided. So how do we engage families in communications instead of just, communicating at them? How do we communicate with them? So some of the things that we are doing is inviting families to write for our parent and family newsletters, inviting them to write an article from their perspective about a topic that has touched their family. We have gotten them recording videos for presentation at admissions events. We've had them be panelists in a webinar or panelists at a presentation. And sharing photos on social media is another way that we've really engaged our families in communicating with other families on our campus. Speaking of social media, misinformation on Facebook groups remains an issue with families. I'm sure that has touched many of our professional lives. And oh, did you see this on this parent Facebook group? How are we going to respond to it? That's a real challenge for us in parent and family programming. Many of us really want to take a proactive route. And we talk about that in this chapter, taking a proactive route to make sure that you have a lot of transparency with what's going on your campus, that you are communicating with your families so that social media does not remain their go-to when it comes to getting information on campus. And those social media groups pose an issue for staff working in higher ed in Texas. In particular, we are all required to report if there's something in one of those Facebook groups that touches on, say, sexual violence or something that's happened to a student, and we're in that group, there may be some expectation that we do some reporting there. So that's something to consider when you're looking at Facebook groups. Looking at portals, I mentioned Campus ESP earlier. There are lots of vendors out there that are developing portals in the higher ed world that are similar to those in K through 12, where families can log in and get access to FERPA information, provided their student allows them access. And so that's very exciting for families because, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, families have had so much access to student information for their K through 12 students that they really do have expectations that that's going to continue in college. And that's something that many of us will be reckoning with. If you're not already using some sort of portal where families can view grades, tuition, any holds the student may have, or something like that. Again, of course, with the student signing off on it. That's something that's definitely coming in the future, and families do have that expectation. And speaking of FERPA, FERPA in academics is, again, like Elizabeth said, a huge transition for a family. And so even if you don't have one of these portals, even if a student hasn't signed a FERPA waiver and there are specifics involving a student records that you cannot share with a family member or a supporter of a student. One of the things that we want to work on in the field is making sure that our campuses our staff are empowered to talk to those families without sharing specifics. Instead of, I always use the example of, you're on the phone and someone says something and you're just like FERPA, click, and you just hang up on them and move about your day. Families need and want information. Again, if we want them to be engaged and not in that disruptive space where their next phone call might be to your president's office, we've got to be able to share that general information with them and not just simply ignoring them over FERPA, while always, of course, being FERPA compliant. These kind of communications with families can really build a lot of that capacity that Amy was talking about in making sure that our families can be great partners in student success. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Amy, who's going to talk about some more specific forms of communication that we have with our families.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. Communication is never more important than when crisis strikes, which is one of the chapters within the book. You'll notice throughout the book, there are these moments that are very focused on sort of dedicated parent-family units and parent-family staff and parent-family programs. And then there are these moments where we're really pushing you to think about family engagement far beyond those who that is their dedicated job responsibility. And I think the crisis strikes or crisis communications chapter is one of those areas where we encourage you to think about family engagement as everyone's job on the college campus. We know that crisis hits in a variety of different forms, from hospitalization to student conduct concerns and the first time they maybe get in trouble, or to grief and loss, to mental health crisis and suicidal ideation, to even those moments of campus disruption or protest and the horrible moments when a student passes away on campus. So crisis can come and strike in a variety of different forms. And the book walks you through what that family interaction may look like during those different crises. But I think what we do here is we pull from family systems theory and other research that we know about how individuals react to crisis. And for families, that can look like uncertainty. It can look like fear and anxiety and dread, or it can really look like hopelessness and helplessness. And so how do we use communication and clear and transparent information, as well as helping to give them very specific actions they can take when that crisis occurs to help them restore that sense of control? And those are some of the tips and resources that are incorporated in the book for you. We use some frameworks out there like Reuben Hill's ABCX model as a framework for thinking about how families will adjust and will respond and adapt to crisis and stress. And it helps you to sort of take stock of how severe is the stressor, what are the resources and supports that family has to cope with that crisis, and how might that family go about perceiving what this crisis really means, and how do they make meaning of that stress, and to what extent is it going to impact that family staying intact. So we give you some frameworks that you can put in place to actually assess what's going on when you're working with a family in crisis, regardless of the type of crisis. And here on the screen, you'll see 4 steps where we challenge you to use families as a tool for crisis prevention. So, really working upstream and trying to prevent crisis by helping families to promote protective factors for their students. And by protective factors, that can be things like social safety and support. It can be problem-solving skills for students, good open communication, harm reduction, helping students to have a sense of purpose. There's a number of protective factors that families can help to promote with their student that helps to prevent crisis from occurring in the first place. And then how do we help families to be on alert for when those concerns arise? So what are those red flags that we would tell families to watch for? Things like hopelessness and hardening of their perspectives, or instability across the environment and in multiple areas, or just withdrawing and lack of connection. So helping families know what those red flags look like when crisis may strike, as well as then teaching families to help de-escalate crisis and to know how to make really good referrals, right? So, okay, this is the resource you want to refer your student to, but how do you get that to stick? So we can teach families skills and help them build skills to help us when crisis strikes. And then the last element here is just keeping this as a part of a layered approach, making sure that when crisis strikes, families share that information back, that there's that two-way communication, with a behavioral intervention team or another group for that centralized consideration of what's going on with the student. So lots of cool frameworks here, but Chris, as you said, really foundational piece is clear and transparent communication with families before and during and after crisis occurs. Elizabeth, I think we're back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So in thinking about belonging on campus, I think if we think back to the beginning of institutions of higher education, it was more of an in loco parentis approach, where we didn't want families on campus. The institution served that role and moved in that way. But at this point, we do want families involved. We do want them to have some buy-in and support and understand that we do want them here, again, in an appropriate way, not overly involved and not under-involved. But how do you help those families understand that they do belong on campus and we do want them involved and engaged? Because we know that if families are involved and engaged, they are able to help support their student to be successful. It is more likely than not that a student is going to reach out to a family member or a support system when they have questions, when they need help or guidance. Even though we tell them to reach out to an academic advisor or a mentor or a faculty member, more than likely they're going to reach out to a family member first. And so going back to what we talked about with orientation and communication, how are we communicating with those families throughout their students' journey at the institution? So that even means early on when you're in the admissions and recruitment process, what is happening at the institution, just to give a nod to those families to make them feel engaged. Maybe it's something as simple as an acknowledgement at a recruitment event, or a sticker, or a table that says welcome families, or an opportunity that just gives them a little inkling that the institution is excited to have them there and does value and want them to be a part of that. The text talks a lot about different ways that institutions can do that and ideas from other institutions that have worked for them to make those families feel involved and engaged. Like I said before, this is as much of a transition for a family member as it is for the student. And so giving them a way to be involved on campus can be really, really helpful along the way throughout a student's journey. So that might be during move-in, when students first move into a residence hall, or the day before classes, what is happening that acknowledges that transition is happening for that family member, and it's okay to move your student in and then head out and make that separation with their student. How do you formalize that process and give it some structure so the family knows, okay, we're still wanted here, just in a different way. And then invite them back to come for family weekend at your institution and experience some different things related to family weekend. Also acknowledging that sometimes family weekends can get really expensive for families. And so depending on when you host a family weekend type activity, being mindful of other opportunities for families so that they can come. So if you're at an institution where a football game or another athletic event is what you focus on for families to attend, that may be out of the price range for families. And so expanding even a family weekend into some other activities to keep those families engaged. Sibling activities. Think beyond just a mom or a dad or aunt or uncle or grandparents, but how are you supporting those siblings? Not only does that help them get engaged and value what their older sibling is doing, but maybe it also even helps with some recruitment. So there's some fun ideas in there about how to get siblings engaged along the way. And then really a more formal way to get families involved is to give them or to create some type of official structure like an association or advisory board. You can do that in a variety of different ways. Institutions all over the state have these set up, and it gives those families an opportunity to really feel like they have a strong voice, sometimes good, sometimes a little bit more challenging, but to advise you in your department and the processes and programs that you are creating. So you're hearing them and you're understanding. Those can also, I think, be really valuable for institutions to have the voice of a family member, because maybe if you've been at a place for a long time, you don't know how things have changed or what families are experiencing. So really using that and valuing that as well. So you can see there's lots of ways to help families feel like they belong on campus. Would encourage you to really think about how are you helping families feel like they belong on campus from that very beginning stage when you're in the recruitment process all the way to the end for graduation or commencement, to know that they have had a role in their student success as well. So Amy, I think back to you to talk about some discussion questions.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So we ended the book with a focus on the future of family engagement, and we gave it some thought. What are the current trends that we saw as we ended the book? And so we wanted to toss it back to you as well as we're wrapping up here to think about what trends you're seeing, whether it be in higher education or in society in general, that relate to maybe the future of family engagement and how these trends might impact our services and our programs for families. Some of the things we threw out in the book related to K-12 educational trends, to those expanded definitions of families, to lessons we learned from the pandemic, and that we're continuing to see and explore the impact of the pandemic on our current student populations and what that means for the student populations entering college now. Adopting cultures of family belonging and mattering, as Elizabeth just discussed, and how we go about removing obstacles for families to be involved. So we were thinking about what some of those obstacles were based on those trends. So I don't know if you have information or trends that you want to share, if anybody wants to share something. I don't think we have the ability, right, though, to open it up for discussion, or if it'd be better to use the chat. What do you suggest, Alex or Josh?
They can actually, I think we have the ability, if they want to
Okay.
raise their hand, I think I can click and bring them up onto to speak, or they can put their question or comment into the chat.
Yeah, I see one in the chat. That's great. So feel free if you want to raise your hand if you'd like to speak, or also if you have questions. So, we'd love to hear what trends you think are impacting family engagement, but also if you have other questions for us. We have about 15 minutes still here. I noticed that someone indicated they host talks via Zoom because of the cost of travel for families, which is such an important piece when it comes to belonging. How do you find ways to make sure this is accessible for all families, whether it be cost, language, other matters of accessibility, timing? Yeah, great one. Other trends. We have a question here about, does anyone do anything different for first generation families? Chris, y'all covered that a little bit, right? And some of or sorry if I'm getting this wrong. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all, or.
No, that's great. There is definitely some information on, how do we do programming that's inclusive of first gen families in that chapter on belonging. And it's a really interesting question, because a lot of times we have trouble defining what first gen families are. And we have a lot of times the chapter talks about how often we talk about first gen families was in kind of a deficit manner instead of an asset-based manner, and not always assuming that first gen families will fit a certain type of demographic, a certain socioeconomic status. And sometimes they don't want to be identified as first gen. And that's true for, I think, first gen students too. But making sure that, again, our programs are inclusive, affordable. They are not focused on, one particular mindset. That's really important in making all families on our campuses feel like they belong.
Yeah, and Chris, it made me think of a piece is in the book somewhere. I can't remember where it's at exactly, where we took a model related to sense of belonging and mattering and kind of applied it to this idea. And it gave us, and these are really basic things, but I think they're so important for, especially for first generation families, but really all families, like asking them what they need or what they think about programs and helping to build their confidence in the fact that we do need them and we do rely on them and that we believe in them and their capabilities. As you said, that strengths approach instead of that deficit-based approach, and finding ways to celebrate their efforts and their accomplishments and achievements, I think was one of the elements on there, and investing energy and time in them. I mean, all of these strategies are critical to all families, but particularly first generation and underrepresented families as well. I saw a comment in the discussion, and Elizabeth, if I didn't mean to skip over you if you had anything to share, but I saw a comment here that kind of relates that involving families so that diverse cultures coming to our campuses feel like their larger support systems or of their family are involved in the student's success, and that as a recruiter, they often heard that they didn't want to leave their home or their family, and we didn't know how to talk to them about including, them in their students' time on the campus. So just that welcoming aspect, knowing that they are welcome. And so thank you for that mention of liking the shift back to this discussion and talking about this here today. So thank you for that comment. That's really great.
I see a couple of questions in the Q&A, and one of them was other platforms for family communication coming up. Can you provide examples of which companies they are besides Campus ESP? Campus ESP is probably the biggest player in this space, but I know, and I cannot think off the top of my head right now, but I know that there are other folks who were looking into developing that. I know that Salesforce, for example, is working on developing some sort of family communications platform. It may be down the road. I know that VZO, which is primarily an orientation registration platform, has also gotten into that space of providing a portal for families within. Again, that would maybe just be within getting ready for orientation. But there are some other folks out there in that space, and I would expect more and more to come. But right now, I think Campus ESP is the biggest player in that area. We have just begun using them on our campus. I think I mentioned earlier that our email open rates were around 70%, and that did not change when we migrated over to Campus ESP. So we've been pleased with the engagement on that platform so far. And then I see another question here in the Q&A that says, what way can you set this tone of engaging family members when you're doing recruitment, local outreach events aimed toward high school students? I know that many of the recruiting events that we go to, not necessarily happening at high schools, but happening around the state, and we may have families of, juniors, even sophomores attending some of these events. We really just, again, make families feel welcome. They're part of this event. We have, our department, Parent and Family Relations, is there just for them to answer their questions, to provide them with, a little gift bag with some information in it from our office, and a little giveaway. We normally give them like a luggage tag or something that's fun, that's just for them, and just be there. All of these other tables may seem like they're for your students, but this one's for you. And we really just make them feel a part of that event. And we generally will participate in some presentations of the services that we can offer families. Having that idea of having that portal is a big, frankly, a recruiting tool, because it lets families know they're still going to have some of that access, although we do have to set those expectations that the student will need to sign off on that in the form of a FERPA waiver. But really just having those services that you can talk to, those communication tools, whether it's a platform or simply an emailed newsletter, or maybe you have a family weekend event, talk about what you offer for families and help them feel like they belong.
I saw a couple of other questions and elements. Elizabeth, I didn't want to skip. Did you want to add anything to any of the questions we've already talked about?
No, other than I think just acknowledging that families are there and also understanding that every institution is structured a little bit differently. So you may not have a standalone department that's dedicated to families. It may be 10% of somebody's job. And so, when you're thinking about what you're communicating out to incoming or prospective students, what you're communicating out to current students, is there a place to put some type of information for a family? Maybe you have a website page that's a landing page for them if you can. But also making sure that those other units on campus that are helping with recruitment, that are helping with working with students in a variety of capacities, also have some resources to direct families to. Again, I think it's about providing a little bit of structure for those families so that you can guide them in the right way, but giving them a place to be. So that would be my other suggestions.
I'm glad you mentioned other units. So Sonia, thank you for the question around HSIs and community college students. So I would mention that a number of the voices from the field throughout the book, several of them come from a community college perspective. And one of the areas that I know is highlighted from some of our colleagues is the idea of engaging advisors in this discussion and helping advisors to have tools to use with families. One of the tools mentioned in the book is Strayhorn's work that relates to managing home ties. So that distance and managing, how do you help students manage all family obligations, I guess is the best term. And so there's a script that he uses that can be a tool for advisors talking with students about those things. Also, we talk a lot about terms and terminology and defining those in different ways for families, whether, we provide some lists in a couple of different places, I think, in the book. I know there's a list in the academics chapter around, these are terms that are just, they're jargon, right? It's educational jargon that families may or may not know what they mean. So how do you make sure that we're being very clear about what terminology is for our families? And then we also take tips again from the work on sense of belonging and mattering. So simple things like knowing, saying, and spelling names correctly is important. Having an interest in backgrounds and experiences of our families and students, especially, it can be critical in providing these strategies, not just at the beginning, not just during recruitment and admission and application processes, but spreading it out throughout the experience. So those are a few things that come to mind related to your question, but I know we have a number of voices from the field in the chapters that come from that kind of community college perspective as well. The other thing that's in the book that we didn't mention here is we have these little sections called Tough Talks, and they're written around different topics. So what are all the topics you can think of that are just difficult to talk with families about or difficult for families to talk with their students about? And it just gives talking points around, here's, if, for example, managing new experiences with diversity can be sometimes difficult for families to talk about. And so giving them talking points and resources for managing those quote unquote tough talks at times. Chris, you want to go ahead and kind of help wrap us up unless there are other questions or
Yeah, I just want to again thank everyone for coming and talking with us about this. I feel like sometimes some of our institutions are just not quite there yet with family engagement and want to learn more. And so we really appreciate your being here. I know that one of the Oh, yeah, I'm still watching the chat here. Yes, I put some information on the book if you're interested, along with a discount code if you would like to use that. But these conversations are growing. I feel like one of the trends that I'm seeing kind of working nationally with others on family engagement is that, with some of the things that we see in higher ed, worrying about enrollment, worrying about some of those things. Families are really going to be crucial, I think, in that retention of students. And so thinking about how you can involve families in supporting student success, again, like Amy said, throughout a student's career, not just at the recruitment phase, not just when they're brand new on campus, but throughout it. How can we make sure that they're getting the information and resources they need to help their students stay on our campuses and thrive? So that to me is one of the biggest things that we're looking at. And then our last slide here, I have our contact information. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I could talk about this stuff all day. So if you ever have any questions about, just want to chat about an idea that you have on your campus, I'd love to talk with you about it.
Well, everyone, thank you. Thanks to our panelists and thanks to everyone who joined for the webinar today. I'm going to give a round of applause to our presenters. This was excellent and really good information. Stay tuned. We'll have more webinar content coming to you very soon. We're still working on some additional webinars coming up, but thanks again to everyone for coming and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh and Alex and your Sonia. Bye.
Yes,
Thank
you
y'all so much. Wonderful job.
Good night.
Great job.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Have a great